So my name is Enrico Zimuel. I'm a principal software engineer at Elastic. And today I would like to talk to you about how to program Elasticsearch using PHP from a PHP perspective developer. So this is the summary that we are going to present today. So basically, I will introduce Elasticsearch with PHP, the client that I'm maintaining for Elastic. We'll talk a little bit about the architecture and the components of this client. We will jump on a couple of examples how to connect to Elasticsearch from PHP with a custom solution, open source, or cloud, Elastic cloud, so different scenarios. I will show you some example for the most common API, how to index, how to get, update, and delete data into Elasticsearch using PHP. I will show you a couple of examples also about the search and the fuzzy search, because I think this is interesting for a lot of people, especially the fuzzy search. If you want to, apply very convenient and very fast way to search data using a fuzzy approach, this is quite simple and absolutely interesting to have in a modern web application. I will also spend a little bit about async communication, because the PHP client offers also an asynchronous way to send the data to Elasticsearch, so no stopping basically. This is interesting in some scenarios, not the majority, because as you know, PHP is mainly used for web application, but still there are new approaches to PHP that, for instance, you can have asynchronous programming with PHP. I don't know if you're familiar with some framework like React PHP or some extension like Zwol. So in this kind of scenarios, when you have basically a PHP script that run in memory with a loop events, you can consume Elasticsearch using an asynchronous approach. That's really nice. And I will also spend a little bit about the future work. So basically, right now, I'm rewriting, I would say from scratch, almost from scratch, the PHP client in order to use modern PHP technology like PSR standards, but I will talk later about that. So let's start with Elasticsearch with PHP. This is the official client for Elasticsearch. This is the repository, so you can have a look. Is under the Elastic GitHub account is Elastic-PHP. It's released and updated with aligned with the Elasticstack version. That means each time there is a new minor or major version of the Elasticstack. For instance, right now we have a few days ago we released 7.10 of the stack. We release also the client. So the client is updated with the stack of Elastic. It uses a connection pool for cluster configuration, because as you know, Elasticsearch is a product that scales horizontally, so you can have multiple nodes, a cluster basically of nodes, and the client is designed to manage a connection pool. That means you can have multiple nodes, and you can the client decide in which nodes the HTTP request should go. So this is completely transparent for the user. It exposes all the API of Elasticsearch, because as you know, Elasticsearch is a client-server, application, and it's expose HTTP API. So in order to use Elasticsearch, basically you have to call this HTTP API, and Elasticsearch for PHP basically leverage this API using function. So I will show you some example, but basically there is a client class in an object-oriented way in PHP that expose all the API using a function and using namespace to collect API together. So basically this function, when you execute it, they return the body of the HTTP response from Elasticsearch or a Boolean in case of add API. Because as you know, an add API is something where basically you request, you make an HTTP request, but you don't get back the body, the response body. So in these cases, the function basically are more convenient to have a Boolean results, because typically, for instance, the index exists API. So this is a specific API that you can use in order to check if some index exists or not. In that case, the response of the function, of the PHP function, will be true or false, because this is usually the response that you are interested in. The body of the response is deserialized from JSON using a serializer interface. So we offer a serializer interface that by default it deserializes into an associative array of PHP. But if you want, you can override it. You can provide your implementation, your custom implementation, to have a special serialization for the output. In case of HTTP errors, the PHP client throws an Elasticsearch exception. That is a specific custom namespace that basically extend the extension of PHP. So you can catch error using this exception. For instance, we offer a lot of different kind of exception. Of course, this is the main namespace. For instance, we have a missing 404 exception. So when, for instance, you want to get an index from Elasticsearch and the index does not exist, the client will throw an exception. We will throw a missing 404 exception. That extends the Elasticsearch exception. So this is basically an exception hierarchy model. All the endpoints of Elasticsearch, the client, are generated using the REST API specification of the Elasticsearch itself. So as you know, Elasticsearch is an open source project. So if you go to GitHub, you can have a look at the source code, and inside two specific folder that I pointed here. So we will share the slide after the presentation. So when you see this underline word, this is basically an hyperlink, so you can have a look at the specific link. And these are basically the folder inside the source code of Elasticsearch that contains all the REST API specification using a YAML configuration file for OSS and XPack. That are the two main difference between the open source version of Elasticsearch and XPack with the more advanced feature of Elasticsearch. So basically that means each time we release a new version of the client, we are completely aligned with the REST API specification of Elasticsearch. And this is auto-generated. So we provided a script. If you are curious, under the /util folder of Elasticsearch PHP repository, you can have a look at the endpoint generator. So this is the name of the generator that basically introspect the REST API specification of Elasticsearch and generate the classes, the endpoints for the specific API. And we use also this approach for testing because of, the PHP client have some, unit test, integration test inside, but we also we run for each version a YAML test. That means Elasticsearch itself contains a bundle of tests represented in a YAML format that are used in order to test the Elasticsearch itself. We use the same test to test the client. So basically, there are more than 2,000 tests inside this YAML specification. And each time we release something, we test against all these tests. So I will say that we do a lot of tests in order to be sure that the PHP client is compliant, of course, with Elasticsearch. Just to give you some number, right now, this is the screenshot of today from packages.org. That is the the repository where when you install something on using Composer, we have more than 40 millions of downloads. And as you can see, this is the graph based on daily installation. So daily we have almost 45K of installation per day. It's very good. I'm very happy about this because it means a lot of people are using it. So as I mentioned, all the API of Elasticsearch are exposed via through PHP functions. So just to give you an idea, these are a table. The first column is the list of some of the Elasticsearch API, like for instance, index is a put with this URL, is translated into the Elasticsearch PHP client using this approach. So basically you have an object that is the instance of the client, $client, and the index is the function name that map the index feature of the API. And you pass a $params that actually is an associative array that contains all the parameter in order, for instance, to index a document. So the ID of the document, the name of the index, and of course the body, the content of the document that you want to index. So we have almost the same for the other operation, like bulk. There is a bulk function, update function, delete, search. And when you have some specific API that are clustered together using a namespace, for instance, the cluster. So there are a lot of API offered from in Elasticsearch that give you that collects all the cluster API. We provide a namespace. So basically you have to call the cluster namespace exposed as a function, as you can see here. And after you can call the stats, the specific API for the cluster. So this is the way that we manage basically the namespace for the function. So this is quite convenient because if you are using, either like, for instance, I'm using Visual Studio Code, you can have auto-completion because the code is auto-generated. So I put inside the PHP doc parameters, all the specifications. So it can be very useful when you develop, an API using Elasticsearch because there are a lot of APIs. So it's very difficult to remember all the parameters. Okay, so how to install Elasticsearch? Of course, we support Composer, so you just have to require from Composer the name of the project, that is Elasticsearch/Elasticsearch. Or you can add in your requirements in the required section of the composer.json file the Elasticsearch/Elasticsearch with a specific version. Right now, the last is 7.10. Okay, so when you have installed Elasticsearch PHP, you can start using it. For instance, imagine that you have an instance of Elasticsearch running on your localhost. This is the default port, 9200. And you want to call just a basic API that is the info API, just to understand if the Elasticsearch is running, for instance. So this is the code that you have to write. So basically, you just requiring the client builder, that is a class of the Elasticsearch client for PHP that creates the instance of the client. As you can see here, we are using, this is a static function create, and we are just passing the host, because we, in order to use the client builder, in order to use the client, you need to specify the host, the URL of the host where Elasticsearch is running. So in this case, it's localhost, and this is the port with the colon. You have basically the URL, colon, and the port. As you can see here, this is an array, and I will show in the next slide why. But you can imagine that this can be a number of different nodes, because if you are managing a cluster. And at the end, we are basically executing this build function, and this build function will create the instance of the client. So at the end, the $client variable will have the Elasticsearch/client instance. So it's the instance where you can basically execute all your endpoints. So as I mentioned, we are interested in the info API. So this is very basic API. You just have to call info and you get the results here in a variable that I name $results. And I'm just var dumping the output. So basically, if we see the var dump, it will look something like this. So it's an array that contains different information like the name, for instance, of the node where Elasticsearch is running, the cluster name, because here in this example I executed Elasticsearch using Docker, the Docker container. And you have a lot of information like, I don't know, the version number. Here I put just in evidence the number of Elasticsearch. This is the version of Elasticsearch. So in this example, I was running the last version that is 7.10. And you have, of course, other information like the flavor of the Elasticsearch. This is the open source version, the version of Lucene that is inside, that is used by Elasticsearch and other stuff. So basically, the result is a simple associative array that you can navigate and get the information. If you are managing a cluster of nodes, so basically a set of different nodes, you can, for instance, call the cluster health API that will give you a snapshot, basically of the architecture, the number of nodes that are inside the cluster and the other information. So in order to do this, basically you have to specify the nodes that are involved in your cluster of Elasticsearch. For instance, here I'm putting this 3 IP address, 1, 2, and 3. And you just build the client and you can execute the cluster health. So we are using the namespace here cluster because the health API is inside this namespace. And we'll get something like this as a response. So basically the name of the cluster, the status of the cluster that is green, so everything is okay. The number of nodes, in this example we have 3 nodes, so it's 3 and etc. So it's quite straightforward. As you can see, it's almost like a wrapper of an HTTP call. So the client tried to apply the best practice in order to connect to Elasticsearch, but at the end the results is this serialization of the HTTP body response from Elasticsearch. So why it's important to use a client like, for instance, the PHP one? Because, as I said, there are inside some best practice in order to connect to a cluster of nodes. For instance, we manage in the PHP clients, there is this connection pool. So basically, give me an example. If you have 3 nodes of Elasticsearch, here we have the client. So basically, if you pass this information to the PHP client, these 3 nodes become a connection pool, and there is a default selector. That means the PHP client will start to send the first HTTP, the first endpoint to the first node, Elasticsearch 1. The second endpoint, the second time you execute another API, it will use the second node, and the third the third node. When you have basically all the node, there is a default selector that is a round robin by default. So basically it will loop. So it will start again from node 1 to node 2 to node 3 and etc. So this is important because if you are not using a client, an HTTP client, but you are just sending straight, for instance, using any HTTP library like, I don't know, Ghazal or even curl in PHP, you need to implement by yourself this architecture, because otherwise you will send the data to the same node. And for traffic, for performance reasons, this is of course bad, especially if you have high traffic application. So imagine that one node becomes unavailable. This is signed as a dead node in the connection pool. That means the client is able to say, okay, the node 1 is dead, so I cannot use it anymore, so I will just use the node 2 and the node 3. So basically, this is important because inside the implementation of the client, the PHP client, there is this logic that it is able basically to manage a connection pool and also to check if a node is alive or dead. And in case it's dead, it basically will be removed from the connection pool. That's the idea. As I mentioned, we provide the round robin as a default selector. We have also a selector interface, so an interface that you can implement if you want to manage your specific needs for a specific connection pool. We offer the round robin, as I said, that again iterate over a set of nodes in a circular order. We provide also a sticky round robin that basically use the current connection unless it's dead. Otherwise, it will jump to round robin. We also offer a random selector that, you can imagine, it pick up a random node from the sets and it use it. But if you are interested in, and if you need to manage, custom configuration, a custom connection pool, you can implement your selector using this selector interface, and you can pass this to the client builder. We offer a set selector function in the client builder, so you can just consume it. Very, very simple. Okay, imagine that right now I just mentioned a couple of examples where you have your Elasticsearch environments in your network. But imagine that you want to use Elastic Cloud. So you want to use an external services like Elastic Cloud. We provide two ways to use it. We provide a basic authentication. So basically you need to specify the Elastic Cloud ID in the configuration of the client. And you can use the basic authentication. So you need to provide the username and the password that are generated when you create a new instance, a new deployment in the Elastic Cloud, and that's it. So as you can see here, I'm not using the URL, so I'm not specifying the URL of the Elastic Cloud. This is basically done inside the Cloud ID. So the Cloud ID, when you pass the Cloud ID, inside the Cloud ID there is the information of the HTTP of the URL, basically. So this is a way to consume Elastic Cloud. Another way that I will suggest is to use the API key instead of the username and the password. So you can have specific, as you know, in the Elastic Cloud, you can generate a specific API key for specific needs, and you can just use an API key, where basically the API key is the base 64 encode of the ID and the key, separated by a column. That means if you want to use the API key, you have just, instead of set basic authentication, you can have the set API key, where you pass as first parameter the ID and the second parameter is the key. That's it. Again, if you are inside the Elastic Cloud and if you go to the API key section, right now you will have the entire base 64. So in order to use this set API key, you need to decode the base 64. So just, you can use PHP, of course, or even the basic 64 command line tool in order to get the two information, the ID and the key. Okay, as I mentioned, everything is the communication between the client and Elasticsearch is using JSON in the body. So in PHP, to use JSON, we have two functions basically that are JSON encode and JSON decode. Starting from PHP 7.3, we can use also the JSON throw on error. That is a flag that you can specify when you want to encode something in JSON. That throws a JSON exception in case of error. So this is quite convenient. This is a new feature of PHP 7.3. and I strongly encourage to use it if you need to decode or encode JSON. That said, inside the PHP client of Elasticsearch, you don't have to encode or decode manually JSON. We provide by default using the serializer interface that I mentioned earlier. And we try to, of course, to apply the best practice also on PHP. So I had that, for instance, the support of the JSON throw on error inside the specialization of the serializer. But there are some issue, as you know, if you use the JSON in PHP, for instance, there is an issue with empty objects. So imagine that you have a JSON, an empty object in JSON. So curly, open curly bracket and closing curly bracket, basically an empty JSON. Elasticsearch use in several locations actually this empty JSON notation. In order to have it in PHP, you need to create an empty object, basically. An empty object in PHP, you need to create a new standard class. As you know, the standard class is the standard class of PHP. So when if you just create an instance of the standard class, it will will create an empty object, basically. This is an example. So imagine that you need to create this JSON in PHP. So as you can see, we have two key, query, and highlight. And inside the highlight, we have fields and content. And the value of content is an empty object. As I mentioned earlier, this is the empty object in JSON. If you want to map this in PHP, you need to create an array, an associative array. For instance, this is the parameter inside the body. So as you can see, it's an associative array, but in the content, you need to create an empty object in PHP. So you need to create an instance of new standard class. So this is important to remember because otherwise it's quite difficult to map to understand how to create an empty object in JSON from PHP. So again, if you need to pass an empty object, you need to use the new standard class. Okay. So let's jump into some example of using for managing data. So to insert, indexing, removing, etc. So basic example, you need to add a document to Elasticsearch. Basically, this is called indexing in the Elasticsearch convention name. So you need to index a JSON document. So how you can do that? You just need to pass inside the parameters the information. So the documents basically is the body. As you can see, the body is an associative array that contains just this simple key and value. The key is test field and the value is ABC. And of course, you need to choose an index name in order to create it. And this is optional. You can actually specify an ID if you have it, or even you can even remove this line ID, and Elasticsearch will auto-generate for you the ID. So in order to index, we have the index function in the client. So we just run the index, passing the parameters, and we can var dump the results. The results is something like this. So it's an associative array where you have the information about the name of the index, the type, that starting from the version 7 of Elasticsearch is always _doc. You have the ID, that is my ID, and you have the results. For instance, this is important because this checking this type, this key, sorry, the results, you can understand if the index has been created successfully. And in this case, it was created. So imagine that you want to manage multiple documents, you know, to index multiple documents. You can do that using one single API, that is the bulk API. So this is quite convenient. So basically, the bulk API of Elasticsearch, it performs multiple index or multiple create, delete, or update action in a single request. It uses ND-JSON as a format. So basically, it's a JSON separated by a new line. So it's like to have multiple JSON documents in one file separated by a new line. How you can do that in PHP? You need to create parameters for the body, passing an array of elements. So basically, if you see here, we are generating 100 body, basically. So imagine that you want to bulk 100 documents, JSON documents, to Elasticsearch in one shot, in one HTTP request. In order to do that, you need to prepare, of course, as I mentioned, with ND-JSON. So basically, in the body, you can add an array, an element. So the first element here is the operation. So we are interested in indexing data. So the first key is index. If I was interested in, I don't know, update 100 documents, here I will have update instead of index. And inside the index, basically you can specify the name of the index that you want to index. The second element of the array is the body, so the content. So basically you have the first that specify the operation, in the second is the document. And in the document here, I just put some key value. And you have the bulk API at the end. So basically you prepare all this associative array with all the document inside, and you can call the bulk API, passing all the parameters. Very straightforward. Imagine that you want to get a document. So you created a document you want to get back. As you can do this, very simple. Get API is an API that gives you the document when you specify the index and the ID. So you just pass the index and the ID here, and you just consume the get. And the response is something, of course, if the document exists, if something like this, where the document itself is inside the underscore source key. So this test field ABC basically is the document that we stored before. I mentioned if the document exists, but if the document does not exist, the client will throw an exception, and a missing 404 exception in particular. So how we can manage this? With try catch. So when we do the get, we can specify the try and the catch, catching for the specific missing 404 exception. And in this case, we can manage as we want. In this example, I'm just printing the document not found with the exception message generated. Let's have a look at the update, how to update documents. So basically, updating documents, you can completely replace the content of an existing document, or even perform a partial update to some files, some fields, sorry. For instance, here I am adding a new field, field inside the previous example of my index with my ID documents. So I have the body. I need to specify the body. The doc is the documents basically, and I'm adding the new field with the value ABC. If we update, if we use the API, the endpoint update, we will have something like this as a response. As you can see, we have almost the same of the previous slide with the get, but with a new field. So this is an example how to add basically perform add a new field, so a partial update. As I said, you can even completely replace the content if you just override the value of the test field, for instance, in this case. Of course, you can also delete a document using the delete API. This is quite straightforward. You specify the index, the ID, and you just call the delete API. Again, it's important to check the results value of the associative array. In this case, if there is the deleted results, basically. Okay, let's jump to, so we basically, we provide some example in order to index, update, change the data into Elasticsearch. Now we are interested in one of the most important feature, I would say, of Elasticsearch, that is search. So the client gives you full access to all the query and parameters exposed by the REST API. And the search API, I would say, it's the most complex API for Elasticsearch because it offers a lot of options and parameters. If you're curious, you can have a look at the documentation. There are a lot of parameters. But using a PHP client, you can use, of course, you can specify all these query and parameters. For instance, imagine that you want to fetch, you want to query some document in Elasticsearch with a match. So this is quite, you know, basic and simple scenario. So basically, you have a test field, the field that we created before, and we want just to search for ABC value of this test field. So these are the parameters you need to specify: the body, the query. So this is the query, and the match. So basically, here we are specifying that we want to match the specific field name and field value. And we offer the search API, that's it. So if we are dump the results, we will have a lot of information, like also the information about the performance, how much time the query used in order to get the results, the max score, because as you know, there is this scoring methodology inside Elasticsearch. So basically, when you search something into Elasticsearch, each results have as a score that give you the quality of the results. So if the results is compliant and how is compliant with the query of the search, basically. All the results are stored under the its array. So this is a sub-array of the its key. So you need to specify its. And here, basically, you have all the results. In this case, it's just one element because we have only one, in this example, only one index document indexed in Elasticsearch. So this is the result. So it's important to remember that it's. You can also imagine that you are, I don't know, migrating a system that you already have in a different language to PHP, or you are looking into an API of Elasticsearch. In the manual, we provide a lot of example. If you go to the website, the manual, the documentation of Elasticsearch, you will see that there are a lot of example using JSON, using curl, and etc. Imagine that you want to just reuse the same configuration, the same JSON document inside the PHP function. You can do that. So basically, instead of giving the body of as associative array, as in the example that I showed here, you can just specify a string that contains the JSON document. So for instance, here we have a $JSON variable that contains a string that is a JSON document. You can just pass it to the body of the parameter, and you can basically, and the client automatically will translate this into the JSON for calling the API. So you don't need to do nothing. This is done automatically. Another interesting feature is the scrolling. So imagine that you have you know, many documents as a result of a search and you want to paginate basically the results. This is the scrolling feature of Elasticsearch. You can do that. You can consume this scrolling, and this is actually more efficient than having all, as you can imagine, the results in memory, because Elasticsearch basically will provide a queue of documents. If you use the scrolling, basically each time you generate a page, you will get a page back from Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch will store this information using a point-in-time snapshot. So this is basically a special ID that give you the possibility to say, okay, I generated I don't know, the second page, I will want to generate the third page. I give you this ID, the point-in-time snapshot, so Elasticsearch will be informed that you want the specific this specific point in time, basically. You can execute a search request using the scroll enable. So you need to enable when you do a search. There is a specific key that this will return basically the page of the document and the scroll ID. That is basically the point in time snapshot that I mentioned. Let me give you an example. So imagine that you want to scroll a search. You need to specify this parameter. The first one, scroll, this is 30 seconds, is basically the time between two different scroll execution, sort of timeout. The size, so we want to have 15 documents in the results. This is the index, and this is the query. So we want to match all. So we want to get all the documents, basically. As you can see here, because match all in the API expect to have a empty JSON object, I need to create an instance of the new standard class, so empty PHP object. I can provide a search, as you can see here. And in order to manage the pagination, so basically we need to provide a loop that gets the first response and check if there are still information inside the response. Because if we are at the end of the last page, we don't have to scroll anymore. So basically, if you see here, there is a condition that where it say that if it's set hits, and the count of hits is greater than 0, so that means if there are still some documents to get, basically I need to iterate inside the pagination. So here you can work on the response array, on the it's that give you the first page, basically the first time that you execute this while. And at the end, you need to call the scroll API. In order to send the scroll API, in the body, you need to pass the scroll ID and the scroll the timeout. The scroll ID is the one that you get from the previous response. So this $response here is the previous response. So you will get an underscore scroll underscore ID. And you need to pass to the scroll API. So as you can see, the first execution is a search, and the second, third, the other execution inside the loop are scroll, are not search anymore. So the first is the search, and from the second to the last one, it will be a scroll, basically. So this is how you can paginate and get all the documents, basically, from the scrolling. One feature, very interesting, is the fuzzy search. What means fuzzy? Elasticsearch is able to search for terms using the Levenstein edit distance. What is this Levenstein distance? Is the number of one character change needed to turn one term into another. Let's give you some example. Imagine that you have a term that is box, and you search for box, for instance. You provide a query, the fuzzy query, searching for all the document that contains the term box. And imagine that you have in your document of Elasticsearch the term fox. Because Fox is one character different from box, because you just change the F to the B and you will get box. So changing one character, Elasticsearch will provide you Fox as a result, because it's close to the box term. So this is the Levenstein distance. This is an example changing one character, but the definition of the Levenstein distance said also that if you remove one character, is the length is 1. So for instance, black lack difference with one character with a B. If you insert a character, the key, sick and sick, and you can also have this transposing two adjacent characters, for instance, act and cat. If you change A and C with C and A, you are swapping basically the order of the two characters. This is also one distant using the Levenstein definition. So this is quite convenient, because if you have this feature, you can actually, if someone, imagine that you are building a web application in PHP, you need to provide a search feature that is fuzzy. If you're starting to write something, but this is not the exact term that is stored in Elasticsearch, you will never get this information. But if you use the fuzzy search, this will give you also the results that are close to the string that you are looking for. So this is quite important. How you can do that in PHP? We use the same search API, but you need to specify in the body of the parameters the query fuzzy. You need to specify the name of the field that you want to check. In this case, is for instance a name. So this is the name of the field and the value. For instance, in this case, I'm doing a fuzzy search, finding the array string. So imagine that you have 3 documents with this string inside. I will marry you because I love you. I will live with Harry. I'm sorry for your loss. Elasticsearch will try to check the distance between all the terms. For instance, in the first case, the distance of Harry with Mary is 1, so it will give insert in the results. In the second, we have the same term, because it's Harry and Harry here, so the distance is 0. So by default, it gets the value from 0 and 1 basically. So also the document 2 will be added into the results. And the last, the closest one is sorry, but the distance is 2, because you need to change 2 characters basically, and will not be in the results. So the results will be basically document 1 and document 2 in this case. So again, this is quite important feature of Elasticsearch, and quite actually simple to implement, because all the work is done by Elasticsearch, of course. Okay, I mentioned that using the PHP client, you can also use asynchronous function. So basically, the client offer a mode called future or async mode that allows you to process batch of requests sent in parallel. So that means you can run in parallel different API. As you know, by default, PHP is a single thread by definition. However, there are some library, some framework, some extension they mentioned early. For instance, the curl, that actually is the library that is also used by the client, the PHP client, provide a function called multi-interface. So there is in the libcurl library a function that give you the possibility to create an HTTP call in an asynchronous way. So no blocking basically. Let me give you an example. Imagine that you want to create an async API in PHP. For instance, the get. You want to run the get and not stopping here for the results, but going moving forward. you need to specify in the parameter a key that is the client with this future lazy. So basically means that the results will not be available the line after the get, but will be available when Elasticsearch will give back the response. And all the time that you basically, how you can basically have this information, because if I say that in $future, this is the response, is an object, it's a particular object of the client that give you like a future response, but how I can get this response back to my code? Each time you look for the information inside this $future as an associative array, for instance, if you are interested in getting the source, the body of the response, HTTP response, each time you ask for reading this information, this will we will force the future to be resolved. So that means if the get has not already been solved, if you explicitly call $future source, it will wait for the response. So that means you need to think to write your application consuming this future only when you really need it, because otherwise they will become blocking. So this is a nice feature, but you need to be you need to do the jump to the async methodology, because otherwise, if you approach in the same synchronous version of PHP, you will not get this feature, basically. So the idea is basically to store the future inside an array, basically, and you can. This is an example where we are getting a different 1,000 documents using an asynchronous approach. So imagine that your application, when you run this code, will provide 1,000 API to Elasticsearch in order to get all the documentation, but these are not synchronous, are asynchronous. That means they try to do this in parallel. Of course, depending on the configuration of the libcurl, you can have even libcurl as an event loop. So he decided to do, I don't know, 10 HTTP call for time after other 10 and etc. But this is from a performance point of view is quite good, because basically you say, okay, I get all the information, I put in an array that is futures here, and when I need it to read some specific document, I can just say, for instance, I can use this function wait that will resolve the specific, in this case, the last document. Imagine that I'm interested in the last document. If I call wait, this will be resolved. That means after this execution, I will have the last documents in memory. Anyway, this is a kind of new approach, especially if you are not familiar with asynchronous in PHP. And I strongly suggest to have a look at this documentation page talking about the future mode of Elasticsearch client. Okay, just to mention a little bit what we are doing for the future, what we are working at the moment. As I said, I basically rewriting from scratch the Elasticsearch PHP client because we would like to use the modern technology, the modern best practice of PHP. In particular, we are interested in PSR standards. So the PSR are the PHP-FIG community standards. So basically, it's a group of people representative of framework library that basically try to come out with best practice and interfaces in order to have a common way to develop application in PHP. So this is good, because if we have standard, we can consume different library, different framework in our project, different feature, but if all they are compatible, because all they implements standard interface, it's more convenient for everyone, because if we don't talk to each other, this is very bad, especially in open source. So this is If you didn't know about this project, I strongly suggest to have a look. Anyway, in the new client, in the new PHP client, we are going to use at least for PSR standard that are PSR3 for logging, PSR7 for HTTP message. So this is very important. So the idea is to basically to create the endpoint of the specific API using this HTTP message that is an object-oriented way to represent HTTP response and requests. And also we will use 17 and 18 for managing the HTTP client and the factories. That means in the new client, you can inject any HTTP client that you prefer in order to perform the transport, the real communication, the HTTP communication between the client and the server. There is not anymore something like the one that we have at the moment that is really focused on curl, basically. So this is a way to open the door to other implementations. So if you have your preferred HTTP client library and you want to use using the Elasticsearch PHP, you can just pass during the instantiation of the client. By default, if you don't pass nothing, we use Guzzle as default HTTP client library. And of course, we will continue to offer async communication using HTTP call. So it is more or less what we are doing at the moment, and we will see new feature and news in the next months about the Elasticsearch client for PHP. Okay, so thanks for listening about this. For listening and watching this presentation. If you want to have more information, I suggest to have to the official documentation of Elastic. There is a very nice book about PHP, and this is the URL. So thanks again for your attention.
All right, thank you, Enrico. So there were not a lot of questions, with the exception of sound issues in the chat. Adam mentioned the Elastica client by Nicola Rufflin, who also happens to work at Elastic. I think it's a high-level client on top of the existing one. Is there anything more that you can probably mention about that, Enrico, or what it does differently, or when you should or should not use it, in case you know it?
Yes, so as you mentioned, Rufflin is also our colleague in Elastic. So he wrote this community library in the past. This is in top of the Elasticsearch PHP client library. This is a low-level client library. So Elastic is more, high level. It offers more object-oriented feature in order to consume the API. There is some utility for bulking, for instance, scrolling, more convenient because it you consume some iterate. For instance, it is a pattern in PHP, common pattern in object-oriented PHP. So I suggest to use it. Why not? It's a very good library, and it uses Elasticsearch PHP under the hood. So why not? Actually, we have also some idea how to help, and I'm actually helping also this project. In my spare time, I will say. So it's definitely something that I suggest to use it.
Awesome, thank you. Then David asks, when will there be support for PHP 8?
It's still, we have a pull request open. I'm reviewing it. So, and this is quite nice because it was a pull request coming from the community. So I just need to review it, and I think we will have it in some days. Very exciting.
That sounds great. Yeah. Simon, I think you may need to add some more context around that question. So the question is it possible to manipulate the search scoring manually using the client class? I'm not sure if you're kind of referring to inference scoring as part of a search request, that you can have different kinds of queries like should clauses in a bool query or anything like that, or if you're like more concretely referring to change something once you retrieve the results back into your PHP application. Also, if you want, you can unmute now.
Yeah, what I was referring to was when I'm doing a search, for example, on different pages, I might want to manipulate what kind of results I want to retrieve from that. So depending on, for example, the domain where I am at, I might want different scoring to, or different records to have a higher scoring. So is that possible from the PHP client to manipulate this, or?
Actually, this is more, it's possible in the sense that when you have the response back, this is an associative array, you can do whatever you want. So you can manipulate as you prefer. But my suggestion is to have a look at the documentation about the search. There are a lot of different, example. You have also aggregate, if I don't remember, if I remember right, where basically you can even aggregate on different level the results. So it's better to have, look at the documentation, and if you have a specific question with specific use case, maybe we can figure out the best query parameter. I don't know, Alexander, if you want to add something on this.
Yeah, from what you said, this sounds to me that this is kind of the classic use case. If you know the domain of a logged in user or anything like that, or his preferences, you use something called the bool query, where you have a so-called must clause listing the kind of criteria that a query has to adhere to. But if it matches a part in the bool query, like the domain name or whatever other criteria you have, it basically gets scored higher and is considered more relevant. And you can also add boosting to this. So this kind of functionality is like one of the core full text search functionalities. And they are basically exposed to the PHP client as well, because you can just write an arbitrary query like this bool query within different clauses in PHP, as well as you could do this using the regular query DSL in JSON.
All right, so the bool query would be used within a compound query, and through that I can add these kind of filters. Okay.
Yes, so the thing you have to look up would basically a bool query, and then the should clause in order to score something higher compared to a document that doesn't have this criteria, and a must clause to make sure that you basically match the regular search you would be executing anyway, regardless from this kind of scoring, manipulation or influencing.
One last question.
Yeah, sure.
During the fuzzy search, you showed the amount of deviation. There was a certain deviation, so 1 or 2 or 0. So that's probably then an option I can also add in my search query, what amount of deviation I'll allow.
The distance, you can specify the distance. There are even here a lot of parameters that you can specify. If you go to the documentation again of the fuzzy, you will have, just give you a brief, example, just to give you the main idea during the presentation. But there are, we can have, I think, Alexander, a completely 1 hour webinar just on the fuzzy parameters.
All right.
Oh yeah, easily. I think the important part here is that this fuzziness and this number applies to each term of your query and not just to all of your terms, and it can never go higher than 2. The main reason for this is that otherwise the search becomes a lot slower, because fuzziness basically takes a bigger toll on the search instead of the query time, like the classic search trade-off. Do you invest time at index time, or do you invest at query time? And this is the reason why you can set it to 0, 1, or 2. And there's also an auto setting, which basically takes the length of a term into account of a search term to decide if you should try for 0, 1, or 2 transpositions.
Okay. And does the fuzzy search also allow for example, approximation based on context? So what I saw was the fuzzy search when writing act, that cat is also accepted, but of course act and cat are completely different subjects. So is that also part of it? So when you would search for cat, that feline, for example, would be a synonym?
Synonyms are not part of a fuzzy search. This is where you really have to go with a synonym in that case. And I think what you might be after in a different thing, which is easily something I could fill another hour, is phonetic search, where you're searching for terms that basically are sounding similar. The most common function for this in SQL databases probably is soundex, but there are much more fancier solutions to this. And there's a so-called phonetic plugin that needs to be installed in addition in Elasticsearch that offers a couple of different algorithms to do these kind of searches.
Okay.
Hopefully see you next time. Thanks a ton for Enrico to step up and have the talk over here. And if you have questions, you can also just join our discussion forum. There's a specific tag for the language clients. Whenever you add that, some of the language client developers usually see this and tend to answer as well. So like if there's something really important that comes to mind 1 hour later, this would be the way to go. All right, then take care, everyone, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.